I needed to breathe air that hadn't been recycled through office ventilation. After months of staring at spreadsheets and sitting through meetings that should have been emails, my shoulders carried knots the size of golf balls. The Appalachian Mountains had always been my reset button, my escape valve when life compressed too tightly around me. The trailhead parking lot was empty. When I arrived early that Tuesday morning, perfect, I shouldered my pack, checked that my water bottles were secure in the side pockets, and took that first step onto the familiar dirt path. The weight of my responsibilities stayed behind in the car. Birdsong followed me as I moved through the first mile of well-maintained trail. The rhythm of my hiking boots against packed earth became a meditation. Left foot, right foot. Each step carried me further from civilization and closer to the version of myself I preferred. The version that didn't need cell service or performance reviews. 2 hours in, I reached the fork I knew well. To the right, the marked trail continued, toward a series of popular overlooks. To the left, nothing official, just a faint game trail barely visible unless you knew to look for it. I'd explored it partially on previous trips, but today I planned to push deeper. I adjusted my pack and turned left. The unofficial path narrowed quickly as I moved away from the maintained trail. Tree branches reached lower here, occasionally brushing against my shoulders. I ducked under a fallen pine, suspended between two massive oaks, and checked my GPS to mark my position. The signal was weak, but present, enough to log my route for later. The forest thickened around me. Mature hardwoods towered overhead, their dense canopy filtering the sunlight into scattered patches on the forest floor. The temperature dropped several degrees in this perpetual shade, a welcome relief from the August heat that had baked the exposed sections of trail. I stopped to drink from my water bottle and eat a protein bar, leaning against a tree trunk covered in emerald moss. The silence here was different from city quiet. No distant traffic or airplane engines, just the occasional snap of a twig as some small creature moved through the underbrush. The first rumble of thunder was so distant I almost thought I'd imagined it. I glanced up, but the tree cover blocked most of my view. What little sky I could see through gaps in the foliage had darkened from clear blue to a threatening gray. I checked my weather app. No signal. Weird. I'd had enough bars to mark my GPS position just 20 minutes earlier. Another rumble closer now. The sensible choice would be turning back to the main trail. But I'd seen mountain storms before. They often passed quickly, especially in late summer. Besides, I'd already covered significant ground on this unexplored path. Turning back meant wasting the opportunity. I pushed forward, picking up my pace. The animal trail I'd been following disappeared into a tangle of rhododendron, so I created my own path, following natural clearings between the trees. My mental map kept me oriented eastward, parallel to the ridgeline. I could occasionally glimpse through breaks in the trees. The forest darkened as clouds gathered overhead, casting everything in premature twilight. The air grew heavy with moisture, that distinctive pressure change that precedes a downpour. Wind whipped through the canopy, setting leaves into frantic motion. The first flash of lightning illuminated the forest in stark white before plunging it back into shadow. 1,000 to 10,003. The crack of thunder interrupted my count. Too close. I moved faster now, scanning for suitable shelter. Rain began to fall, light at first, then quickly intensifying into vertical sheets that hammered through the canopy. Within minutes, water streamed down my face, despite my hood. The trail beneath my boots turned to slick mud, threatening my footing with each step. Another lightning strike. This one close enough that I felt the electricity in the air. The following thunder didn't roll. It exploded overhead, a physical force that I felt in my chest. Through the curtain of rain, I spotted a dark shape ahead, a rock formation jutting from the hillside. I made for it, half jogging, half sliding down the increasingly treacherous slope. The granite overhang created a shallow cave, not deep, but enough to get out of the direct downpour. I pressed my back against the cold stone wall and caught my breath. Water dripped from my hair, my jacket, my pants, everything saturated despite my supposedly waterproof gear. Lightning continued to flash, illuminating the forest in strobing bursts. I watched a massive oak, perhaps 200 yards away, take a direct hit. The crack was deafening as the trunk split, sending splinters flying in all directions before the top half crashed to the forest floor. I shrank further under the rock overhang, suddenly very aware of my vulnerability. This was no ordinary summer's storm. The violence of it felt personal somehow, as if the mountain itself had decided to remind me who was in charge. Water began streaming down the hillside, channeling alongside my stone shelter and pooling at my feet. I pulled my knees up, trying to keep at least some part of me dry, but it was a losing battle. The temperature dropped sharply as the storm intensified. My wet clothes clung to me, stealing body heat. I removed my pack and dug for my emergency thermal blanket. The thin metallic sheet wasn't much, but it would help retain what warmth I had left. I wrapped it around my shoulders, its crinkle barely audible over the roar of the storm. Time stretched as I waited for the weather to pass. My watch told me only 40 minutes had elapsed, but it felt like hours. The constant assault of rain and lightning was exhausting. I leaned my head back against the rock wall just for a moment, just to rest my eyes while I waited. The rumble of thunder became a lullaby. My eyes grew heavy. I fought to stay alert. Falling asleep while cold and wet wasn't the wisest choice, but exhaustion won. I don't know how long I slept. When I opened my eyes, the world had transformed. The storm had passed. Not a single drop of rain fell. The wind had died completely. The forest stood motionless around me, water still dripping from leaves, but without the driving force of the storm behind it. What struck me immediately was the silence. No birds called, no insects hummed, even the typical background sounds of a forest. The rustle of small animals, the creak of branches, were absent. The quality of the quiet felt wrong, like a held breath or a paused recording. I stood, joints stiff from sleeping in such an uncomfortable position. The thermal blanket fell away as I stretched, my movements seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. The light had changed. It wasn't darker in terms of time. My watch showed early afternoon, but the forest appeared more deeply shadowed than before. Colors seemed muted, less vibrant. The familiar green of the Appalachian summer woods had darkened to something closer to pine than emerald. "Hello," I called out, more to break the silence than expecting a response. My voice fell flat, as if the air itself absorbed the sound. No echo returned. I repacked my thermal blanket and shouldered my bag, wincing at the dampness that still pervaded my gear. The rain had soaked through everything despite the protection of the rock overhang. Stepping out from my shelter, I surveyed the area. The path I'd made coming down to the overhang was barely visible now, washed away by the water that had cascaded down the hillside during the storm. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun lazily, taking too long to settle. When it finally stopped, it pointed in a direction that didn't make sense based on my mental map of the terrain. I shook it, thinking perhaps the storm had affected it somehow, but the result was the same. My GPS device showed the same confusion, according to its display. I'd somehow moved several miles from my last marked position. An impossible distance, given that I'd been sheltering in one spot. I looked up at the sky, visible through the canopy. The clouds had thinned, but still covered much of the blue. They moved in a direction that contradicted what my compass showed as north. Something was very wrong. I took a drink from my water bottle and ate another protein bar while considering my options. The smart move would be retracing my steps to the main trail, but with my navigation tools malfunctioning and the path washed away, back wasn't as straightforward as it should have been. I could still see the mountain ridge to the north, or what should have been north. That was something solid to orient myself by. I remembered passing a distinctive three-pronged dead tree on my way in. If I could find that, I could work backward to the main trail. Decision made. I started hiking uphill, away from the overhang. The ground squished beneath my boots, still saturated from the rain. Mist rose from the forest floor as the lingering heat of the day attempted to dry the sudden moisture. The trees seemed different, taller, older, more gnarled than I remembered passing earlier. Their bark appeared darker with deeper furrows. Moss grew thicker on their northern sides, at least what I believed to be north, based on the ridge rather than my unreliable compass. I hiked for 20 minutes without recognizing any landmarks. The forest had transformed during the storm, or perhaps had become disoriented while sleeping. Either way, nothing looked familiar. What bothered me most was the continued silence. In all my years hiking these mountains, I'd never experienced such a complete absence of wildlife sounds, even after storms. Birds typically returned quickly, singing their relief at having survived. This quiet felt watchful, patient, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stopped and took another compass reading. The needle had settled into a more consistent direction now, but it still didn't align with what I knew to be true about this terrain. According to the compass, I was heading west, but the ridgeline, which I knew ran east to west, was clearly visible to my right, meaning I should have been traveling south. I pulled out my map and tried to reconcile my position with the landscape around me. Nothing matched, according to my map. There shouldn't have been a granite overhang like the one I'd sheltered under anywhere in this section of forest. The realization settled heavily in my stomach. I was lost, not just off-trail lost, but fundamentally disoriented in a forest that suddenly felt alien despite having hiked these mountains for over a decade. I took a deep breath. Panic was the enemy of survival. I needed to make a logical decision rather than wandering aimlessly. The mountain peak should have been visible through the trees from higher ground. I decided to climb to a better vantage point. From there, I could hopefully spot a landmark distinctive enough to locate myself on my map. I adjusted my course toward higher ground, pushing through undergrowth that seemed to catch at my clothing more aggressively than normal. The branches of smaller trees bent toward me rather than away, an illusion created by the strange light, I told myself. The forest grew denser as I climbed. Trees crowded closer together, their trunks twisted into shapes I didn't recognize from native Appalachian species. The color of their leaves seemed off, darker, with hints of colors that didn't belong in a summer forest. An hour of climbing brought me to a small clearing. I stopped to catch my breath and take another reading. My compass now pointed in yet a third direction is north, rendering it completely useless. My GPS showed no signal at all, the screen displaying only an error message. From this higher vantage point, I could see further through breaks in the canopy. What I saw didn't make sense. The mountain peak that should have been visible to the west was simply gone. In its place was an unbroken sea of treetops extending to the horizon. The landmarks I'd used to navigate for years had vanished, replaced by an endless forest I didn't recognize. Even the quality of light filtering through the trees felt wrong. Not the golden green of Appalachian summer, but something cooler, bluer, like light through deep water. I sat on a fallen log trying to process what was happening. Had I somehow walked much further than I thought during those 2 hours before the storm? Had I crossed into a section of the mountains I'd never explored before? It seemed impossible, but no more impossible than the familiar landscape simply changing around me. The log beneath me felt wrong against my hands, the bark too smooth, the wood too warm. I pulled my hands away quickly and stood up. That's when I noticed the silence had changed, not broken. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, but altered somehow. The quality of the stillness had shifted from empty to expectant. I was being watched. The feeling crawled across my skin, raising the hair on my arms. Despite the humidity, I turned slowly, scanning the trees surrounding the small clearing. Nothing moved. No branches swayed. No leaves rustled. Everything remained perfectly, unnaturally still. Yet the sensation of eyes on me intensified. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and insignificant in the pressing silence. No response came, but the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. A physical weight of attention focused on me from all sides. I picked up my pace, no longer concerned with finding the correct path back, but simply moving away from that clearing and the invisible scrutiny that filled it. The direction didn't matter anymore. I just needed to put distance between myself and whatever watched me. The forest seemed to close in as I walked, the spaces between trees narrowing, branches reaching lower, undergrowth growing thicker. Every step required more effort than it should have, as if the forest itself resisted my passage. The light continued to change, dimming though my watch showed. Mid-after afternoon, shadows lengthened and deepened, taking on shapes that didn't match the objects casting them. Tree shadows bent in directions that contradicted the angle of the hidden sun. Something was very wrong with these woods, and increasingly I suspected it had nothing to do with my navigation skills or memory. The forest itself had changed, or perhaps I had stumbled into a part of it that had always been different, but remained hidden from casual hikers. All I knew for certain was that I needed to find my way back to the marked trail, back to my car, back to the world that made sense. Whatever waited in these altered woods wasn't something I wanted to meet. I pulled my hands away from the strangely smooth log and stood up, that crawling sensation of being watched intensifying with each passing second. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice sounding weak against the pressing silence. Nothing answered, but the weight of attention didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, like physical pressure bearing down from all directions. I needed to move anywhere away from this clearing and whatever invisible presence filled it. I grabbed my pack and picked a direction that seemed to lead uphill. Direction didn't matter anymore. I just needed distance between myself and that watching presence. After several minutes of walking, I stopped and pulled out my compass again. The needle spun lazily before settling in a direction that made no sense given the position of the ridgeline visible through breaks in the canopy. According to the compass, I was heading north. According to the ridge, which I knew ran east to west, I was moving southeast. I checked my GPS device next. The screen displayed coordinates that placed me miles from where I should have been. Impossible given the time I'd been hiking. The electronic map showed my position in a section of forest that shouldn't exist according to my paper map. "This is insane," I muttered, shoving both devices back into my pack. I'd have to rely on natural navigation. The mountain peak should be visible from higher ground, and once I could see it, I could orient myself properly and find my way back to the main trail. I adjusted my course toward what seemed like higher elevation, pushing through undergrowth that seemed to catch at my clothing and skin. Branches scraped against my arms, leaving thin red lines that stung in the humid air. The forest grew denser as I climbed. Trees stood closer together, their trunks twisted into shapes I didn't recognize from any Appalachian species I'd encountered before. Their leaves looked wrong, darker with tints of colors that didn't belong in summer foliage. My boots crunched against the leaf litter, each step sounding too loud in the unnatural quiet. I listened for any wildlife, the chirp of birds, the rustle of small mammals, even the buzz of insects, but nothing broke the silence except my own movements. I hiked for what my watch said was an hour, though it felt much longer. The forest changed around me, the trees growing older and more massive. Their enormous trunks created cathedral-like spaces between them, roots rising from the ground like ancient buttresses. In any other circumstance, I might have found this section of forest magnificent. Now, it only deepened my unease. These trees looked centuries old. How had I never encountered them in my previous hikes through these mountains? My water bottle was half empty when I paused to take another drink. That's when I noticed something else strange. The quality of air had changed. A faint odor hung in the still atmosphere, barely perceptible, but undeniably present. Something off. I continued forward, and with each step, the smell grew stronger. At first, I thought it might be a natural forest odor, perhaps fungi or decaying plant matter, but it quickly revealed itself as something far worse. The stench became so potent I had to breathe through my mouth. It was the unmistakable smell of rot. Not the earthy decomposition of fallen logs or leaf mold, but the sickly sweet putrescence of decaying flesh. My pace slowed as every instinct told me to turn around, to move away from that smell rather than toward it. But some darker curiosity pushed me forward. What animal had died out here? How large would it have to be to produce such an overwhelming odor? Through a gap in the massive tree trunks ahead, I caught sight of something that didn't belong in the forest, something pale against the dark browns and greens of the woods. I moved closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Not an animal, a person. A body was fixed to a large oak tree about 20 yards ahead of me. Even from this distance, I could see it had been there for some time. The corpse was secured to the trunk with what looked like crude metal spikes driven through the limbs, holding it upright in a grotesque display. My mind rebelled against what my eyes showed. Me. This couldn't be real. Perhaps exhaustion and disorientation were causing me to hallucinate. But as I forced myself to approach, the horrible reality became undeniable. The body, I couldn't tell if it had been a man or woman, had decomposed significantly. Flesh hung in rotting tatters from exposed bone. The face had deteriorated beyond recognition, with empty eye sockets staring out from a skull partially covered with leathery skin. What struck me most weren't the normal signs of decomposition, but the evidence of what had happened before death. Deep cuts crisscrossed the torso, methodical and deliberate, and from these wounds leaked a substance that couldn't be natural, a thick yellow-green fluid that had hardened like sap around the edges of the cuts. I backed away, my hands shaking uncontrollably. This wasn't a random occurrence or an accident. Someone had done this deliberately. The placement of the body, the way it was displayed on the tree. This was a message or a warning. My stomach heaved violently. I turned and stumbled behind a nearby tree, just in time to empty my stomach onto the forest floor. I braced myself against the trunk, retching until nothing remained but bitter bile. When the nausea subsided enough for me to think clearly, I pulled my phone from my pocket with trembling fingers. I needed to call for help. Park rangers, police, anyone. The screen showed no service bars. Not even emergency calls would go through in this remote location. I glanced back at the grotesque display. Details I hadn't noticed in my initial shock now became apparent. The victim's hiking boots, still intact below decomposed legs. A tattered backpack similar to mine lay at the base of the tree, its contents scattered across the ground. Another hiker, someone like me who had wandered too far off the marked trails. The implications sent ice through my veins. Whatever had happened to this person could happen to me, might already be happening. That sense of being watched suddenly took on a far more sinister meaning. I backed away from the scene, unwilling to turn my back on it until I had put several trees between myself and the displayed corpse. Then I turned and moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, picking a direction that led downhill away from the body. My mind raced with questions I didn't want answers to. Who would do such a thing? How long had the body been there? Were there others? More importantly, was whoever responsible still in these woods? The forest remained unnaturally silent as I pushed through underbrush and ducked beneath low-hanging branches. No birds called warnings of my passage. No squirrels scattered at my approach. The absence of wildlife now seemed not merely strange, but ominous. The animals knew to stay away from this place. They understood something I was only now beginning to grasp. I checked my compass again, desperate for any reliable guidance. The needles still pointed in a direction that contradicted my understanding of the landscape. But at this point, any direction that led away from that horrific scene was the right one. My pace increased to a jog wherever the terrain allowed it. Branches whipped against my face and arms as I moved, but I barely noticed the stinging cuts they left behind. The physical pain was nothing compared to the image seared into my mind. That body displayed like a trophy or a threat. I needed to find the main trail, find other hikers, find my way back to my car, and civilization. Every step in these woods now felt like moving deeper into danger rather than toward safety. As the slope grew steeper, I half ran, half slid down the hillside, using tree trunks to control my descent. My hiking boots slipped on patches of wet leaves, nearly sending me tumbling more than once. After 10 minutes of reckless downhill movement, I stopped to catch my breath and check my surroundings. The massive cathedral-like trees had given way to younger forests again. The undergrowth was thicker here, making progress slower. I listened carefully, hoping to hear any sound that might indicate human presence. Voices on a trail, the distant rumble of vehicles on a road, anything that would point me toward safety. The silence remained absolute, except for my own labored breathing. I took a drink from my water bottle, trying to calm my racing thoughts and think rationally. Panic would only make my situation worse. I needed a plan. The main trail had to be somewhere to the west of my current position, or what I believed to be west, based on the ridgeline rather than my malfunctioning compass. If I kept moving downhill and westward, eventually I should intersect it, or another path that would lead back to civilization. I was assuming this was still the same forest I'd entered this morning. Increasingly, it felt like I'd stepped into somewhere else entirely during that strange storm. I shouldered my pack again and continued my descent at a more controlled pace. The weight of unseen eyes followed me. That persistent feeling of being observed, never fading completely. Every few minutes I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something trailing behind me. The forest remained empty. Yet, that sensation of being watched only intensified. What kind of person would kill a hiker and display their body like that? And what had created that unnatural yellow-green substance in the wounds? These questions circled in my mind as I pushed through the thick undergrowth. Each step carried me further from that grotesque scene, but the horror of it traveled with me. I needed to get out of these woods now, before I joined that poor hiker. As another warning on another tree, I crashed through the underbrush, my boots slipping on patches of wet leaves as I fled downhill away from that terrible scene. My lungs burned with each breath, partly from exertion and partly from the lingering stench of death. After running for what felt like miles, I slowed to catch my breath. My legs trembled from the sudden burst of activity and the shot of adrenaline that was now wearing off. I leaned against a tree trunk, gulping air and trying to organize my thoughts. The main trail had to be somewhere. Civilization couldn't be that far away. People hiked these mountains every day. I couldn't possibly be the only person for miles. I checked my watch. 4 o'clock. I still had a few hours of daylight left, but the forest already seemed darker than it should have been at this hour, the canopy blocking much of the light. After my breathing steadied, I pulled out my water bottle and took careful sips. I needed to conserve what I had left. Who knew how long it would take to find my way back to civilization? Think, I said aloud, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet forest. What's the most logical direction? Downhill usually led to water. Water usually led to people. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. I started walking again, keeping to the natural contours of the land that led downward. The forest continued its eerie silence. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots on the forest floor, and my own breathing. An hour passed, then 2. The terrain changed subtly around me. The younger growth forest gave way to older trees again, their massive trunks spaced further apart. They created long cathedral-like spaces between them, arching branches meeting high above like wooden rafters. In any other circumstance, I would have stopped to appreciate their beauty. Now their immense size only emphasized how small and vulnerable. I felt my shadow stretched longer as afternoon crept toward evening. My stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since that protein bar hours ago. I'd been so focused on moving away from the horror, I discovered that I'd forgotten about basic needs. I stopped to eat one of the granola bars from my pack, washing it down with precious sips of water. While I rested, I tried my phone again. Still no signal. My GPS device remained equally useless, showing coordinates that made no sense based on where I believed I was. The daylight was fading faster than it should have been. The spaces between trees grew dimmer, shadows pooling around the massive trunks. I needed to find shelter soon. I picked up my pace, following what looked like a natural depression in the land that might lead to a stream. Water meant life, and life might mean people. Through a gap in the trees ahead, I spotted something that didn't belong in the forest. Straight lines and right angles where there should have been only organic curves. I moved closer, cautious after my earlier discovery. A building stood in a small clearing, its weathered wooden walls almost the same color as the surrounding tree trunks. It was an old church, the kind you might find in any small mountain community with a modest steeple, or what remained of one. The bell tower had partially collapsed, leaving a jagged hole in the roof. Several windows were broken, their glass long gone. My heart leaped at this sign of civilization, even an abandoned one. Churches meant communities. Communities meant roads. Roads meant a way out. I approached slowly, scanning the treeline around the clearing for any movement. The church had clearly been abandoned for years. Vines crept up its walls, and moss covered parts of the roof that remained intact. As I got closer, my initial relief curdled into dread. Smeared across the exterior walls was that same yellow-green substance I'd seen on the corpse. Not random streaks from weather or neglect, but deliberate markings. Crude symbols that might have been letters in some alphabet I didn't recognize. I stopped about 20 feet from the building, torn between the need for shelter and the warning signs screaming at me to stay away. The sun would set soon. Being in the forest after dark, with no shelter, wasn't a good option either. "Hello," I called toward the church, not expecting an answer, but needing to break the silence. "Anyone there?" Nothing responded but the creak of wood as the old building settled. I circled the perimeter, staying at a safe distance. There was a single entrance, double doors at the front, one hanging partially off its hinges. The back wall had no exit, just a row of tall, narrow windows, most with their glass missing. The light was fading quickly now. I needed to make a decision. Logic battled with instinct. Logic said, an abandoned building provided better shelter than the open forest. Instinct screamed that anything marked with that substance meant danger. A cool breeze picked up, carrying the promise of another cold night. That decided it. I would check inside, but stay ready to run at the first sign of trouble. I approached the entrance, stepping carefully up the warped wooden steps. The porch boards groaned under my weight. One of the front doors hung open at an awkward angle. The other was missing entirely. I paused at the threshold, peering into the dim interior. The church consisted of a single room, a sanctuary with rows of wooden pews facing a simple altar at the far end. Dust motes floated in the beams of fading light that streamed through the broken windows and the hole in the roof. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The musty smell of old wood and mildew hit me first, then something else. That same sweet, sour stench of decay I'd encountered earlier. My eyes, still adjusting to the dimmer light, slowly made out shapes in the shadows. The first one I recognized stopped me cold. A human figure lay spread eagle on the floor near the altar, arms and legs stretched out in a star pattern. Even in the poor light, I could see metal spikes driven through the wrists and ankles, pinning the body to the wooden floorboards like a grotesque specimen. My stomach lurched. I took an involuntary step backward, bumping into the door frame. As my eyes adjusted further, more horrors revealed themselves. In the front pew to the left sat another figure, a woman based on the long hair and dress, but her head was missing. Her hands were folded primly in her lap, an obscene parody of prayer. The stump of her neck was covered in that same yellow-green substance, which had hardened like candle wax. Movement caught my eye. Not a person, but hundreds of flies buzzing around the bodies. The sound had been masked by the blood rushing in my ears. I wanted to run, but my eyes kept finding more details in the shadows. 3 smaller figures were positioned around the room, children arranged in poses that mimicked play. One knelt in a corner, hands clasped, as if in prayer. Another was propped against the wall, holding what looked like a toy. The third hung from exposed rafters, suspended by wires wrapped around its limbs like a marionette. This wasn't random violence. This was an arrangement, a display. Someone had killed an entire family and positioned them with deliberate care. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Why would anyone do this? What kind of person would not only murder a family, but take the time to arrange their bodies in this twisted tableau? Bile rose in my throat. I stumbled backward onto the porch, doubled over in wretched, until nothing came up but bitter acid. My whole body shook with revulsion and fear. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and looked up. The forest had grown significantly darker in just a few minutes I'd been inside the church. Night was falling fast, bringing with it a new terror. Being in the open darkness with whatever monster had created that scene inside. I was trapped between 2 nightmares. Spend the night in a decaying church with 5 murdered bodies, or wander a strange forest in complete darkness, possibly crossing paths with their killer. Neither option seemed survivable. I backed away from the church, moving toward the tree. My mind raced through possibilities. Could I climb a tree and wait out the night? Find a natural shelter like the rock overhang from the previous night? Keep walking in hopes of finding the trail or a road? A loud crack from inside the church froze me in place. Something or someone was moving inside. I whirled around at the sound of movement from inside the church, every muscle in my body tensing to run. The noise came from near the altar in the shadows beyond the arranged bodies. They made such interesting sounds when they died. The voice cut through the stillness of the church, casual and conversational, as if discussing the weather. I froze, my eyes straining to see into the darkness. A tall figure stepped forward from behind the altar, moving with the confidence of someone on familiar ground. As he came into the fading light, streaming through the broken windows, I saw a man with long, matted hair that hung past his shoulders in tangled clumps. His clothes, what might have once been ordinary outdoor wear, were marked with dark stains and smears of that same yellow-green substance that covered the body. His face came into view, and my stomach dropped. Weather-beaten skin stretched over sharp features, but it was his eyes that struck me most, pale and alert, studying me with detached interest like I was an insect under glass. "Most people run right away," he said, gesturing toward the bodies. "You stayed longer than most. Curious type, aren't you?" I took a step backward toward the door, my foot catching on a loose floorboard. The man's eyes tracked the movement. "I'm Robert," he said, as if we were meeting at a campsite rather than in this house of horrors. "And you've wandered somewhere you really shouldn't be." My mouth felt too dry to speak. I swallowed hard, buying seconds to think. "I'm just trying to find my way back to the main trail," I managed to say, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous room. Robert laughed, a sound without humor. "There is no trail back to where you came from. Not anymore." He took another step forward, running his hand along the back of a pew. This is our territory now. Has been for a long time. I asked, glancing around the church. Me and the boys. We've made ourselves a nice little home out here, away from all the noise. His hand moved to the headless woman in the front pew, patting her shoulder with disturbing familiarity. We don't much care for visitors. I kept inching backward, trying to maintain distance between us, while getting closer to the door. The family, Robert continued, nodding toward the arranged bodies. They came camping about a month back. Nice setup, expensive gear. Dad was some kind of doctor from Charlotte. He spoke as if recalling old friends. They ignored all our signs, the markings on trees, the warning symbols. My back bumped against something solid, a damaged pew, blocking my direct path to the door. I'd need to go around it. We watched them for 2 days, Robert said, his voice taking on an animated quality. Jim wanted to scare them off, but Tom said we needed to send a stronger message. Can't just have people wandering in whenever they feel like it. He moved again, drifting sideways in a way that put him between me and the exit. The casual way he positioned himself made it clear this wasn't accidental. The little ones went quick. That was Tom's idea. Said it was more merciful. I don't much care either way. He shrugged. The parents took longer. Wanted to know if they'd told anyone where they were going, if anyone would come looking. I felt sick again, my eyes darting to the exit, calculating distances and angles. You're wondering if you can make it to the door before I catch you, Robert said, reading my thoughts with unnerving accuracy. You can't. His hand moved to his belt, drawing a hunting knife with a worn wooden handle. The blade caught what little light remained in the church, glinting dully. See, now we've got a problem, he said, his tone still conversational. You've seen things you shouldn't have, and I need to know how you found this place. And who else knows you're here? I spotted a broken piece of wood lying near my feet, part of a pew that had collapsed. It looked solid enough to use as a weapon. Nobody knows I'm here, I said, trying to keep him talking while I figured out what to do. I got lost during a storm yesterday. Been trying to find my way back ever since. Robert tilted his head, considering me. You don't look like you've been out here that long. I slept under a rock overhang last night, I said, edging to my right, trying to get a clearer path to the door. Found this place by accident. Happy accident for me, Robert said, his lips pulling back in what might have been a smile. Not so much for you. He moved then, crossing the distance between us with surprising speed. The knife came up as he lunged. I dropped down, grabbing the broken piece of wood and swinging it upward with all my strength as I rose. It connected with the side of Robert's head with a sickening crack. He staggered sideways, crashing into the wall beside the altar. Blood immediately began flowing from a gash in his scalp, running down the side of his face. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I bolted for the door, jumping over the fallen pew and racing across the dusty floor. I'd almost reached the exit when something slammed into my back, sending me sprawling onto the warped floorboards. Robert had recovered faster than I expected and tackled me from behind. The knife glinted in his hand as he tried to bring it down toward my face. I grabbed his wrist with both hands, straining to keep the blade away. His blood dripped onto my face as we struggled, hot and sticky. The smell of him hit me then. Unwashed body and something else. Something chemical and wrong. You'll look nice next to the others. He grunted, pushing the knife closer to my throat. My arms began to shake with the effort of holding him back. He was stronger than he looked, his muscles hardened by whatever life he lived out here in these woods. I remembered my pocket knife, a small folding blade I kept for cutting cord or opening packages. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I let go with one hand, reaching frantically for my pocket while using all my remaining strength to keep his knife at bay. My fingers closed around the pocket knife. I fumbled it open, the small blade springing out with a click that Robert noticed too late. I drove it into his shoulder with as much force as I could manage. Robert howled, rearing back, the hunting knife momentarily forgotten as he clutched at the wound. I scrambled out from under him, getting to my feet and staggering toward the door. He was right behind me, blood flowing from his scalp and shoulder now, his face twisted with rage. We collided in the doorway, his hands grabbing at my jacket, my pack, anything to hold me. I swung wildly with my fists, connecting with his jaw, his chest, whatever I could reach. We tumbled down the rotting porch steps together, landing hard on the ground outside the church. The fall separated us for a crucial moment. I rolled away, getting my feet under me, my lungs burning as I gulped air. Robert was slower to rise, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. His eyes found mine in the gathering darkness, and I saw something worse than anger there. A calm, calculated hatred that promised suffering. "You're dead," he said quietly. "You just don't know it yet." I turned and ran into the forest, branches slapping my face as I pushed through the underbrush. Behind me, I heard Robert's voice unnaturally loud in the quiet woods. "Jim, Tom, Will, we've got a runner." His words sent fresh terror through me. There were more of them out here. I ran harder, not caring about direction or landmarks, focused only on putting distance between myself and the church, between myself and Robert. The forest grew darker around me as night fell completely, but I didn't slow down. Somewhere in the darkness behind me, I heard answering calls to Robert's shout, other voices coming from different directions. I was being hunted. My chest burned with each desperate breath as I plunged deeper into the forest. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead in the near total darkness. Tree branches whipped across my face and caught on my clothing. Each impact stung against skin already raw from my earlier flight. The only light came from occasional breaks in the canopy, where fragments of moonlight spilled through. It wasn't enough to navigate by, only enough to cast everything in ghostly blue-white shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I ran without direction or purpose beyond escape, away from the church, away from those arranged bodies, away from Robert with his casual cruelty and hunting knife. Behind me, answering calls echoed through the trees, male voices coming from different directions. Where? East side. Got movement. They were communicating, coordinating, not just chasing, but hunting methodically. I changed direction, veering sharply right, hoping to throw them off. My foot caught in a tangle of roots, and I stumbled, nearly falling, but caught myself against a tree trunk. The impact knocked the remaining air from my lungs. I paused, gulping oxygen, trying to quiet my breathing enough to listen. The forest around me had fallen silent again. No voices, no footsteps. This silence frightened me more than the shouting. They were being careful now, listening, tracking. I moved again, slower this time, trying to pick my way through the darkness with some semblance of stealth. My hands reached out in front of me, feeling for obstacles before I crashed into them. A twig snapped somewhere to my left. I froze. Another sound. The soft crunch of leaves under a careful footstep. Closer this time. I crouched lower, trying to make myself smaller. My hand closed around a rock the size of my fist. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. Minutes passed. Intense silence. The night sounds of the forest, what few there were in this strange place, resumed around me. Maybe they'd passed by. Maybe I had evaded them. I started moving again, inching forward in what I hoped was the opposite direction from where I'd heard the footsteps. A beam of light cut through the darkness ahead of me, a flashlight sweeping back and forth between the trees. I dropped flat to the ground, pressing myself into the dead leaves and dirt. The light passed over me, then swung back. It fixed on my position, blinding me. "Got him," a voice called out, different from Robert's, younger, tighter with excitement. I scrambled to my feet and bolted, abandoning any pretense of stealth. The light followed me, bouncing wildly as its owner ran in pursuit. More shouts, more lights appearing between the trees. converging on my position. I couldn't outrun them all, not in the dark, not in their territory. A fallen tree loomed in front of me, visible only at the last second. I tried to jump it, but my foot caught on a branch. I went down hard, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. Pain shot through my ankle as it twisted beneath me. Before I could get up, they were on me. 3 beams of light converged, pinning me in their glare like a specimen on a slide. I threw up a hand to shield my eyes. The rock still clutched uselessly in my fist. "Drop it," ordered a deep voice. "I'll let the rock fall." 3 men emerged from behind the lights. One was tall and muscular with a shaggy beard and cold eyes. Another was leaner, wiry, constantly scanning the forest around us. The third stood slightly back, a shotgun held casually but expertly in his hands, pointed at my chest. "Well now," said the bearded one. "What do we have here?" Rob said. "You put up quite a fight." "Please," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm just trying to get back to the trail. I don't want any trouble." The lean one laughed, a sound without humor. "Bit late for that, wouldn't you say? Rob's shoulder looks pretty bad." "Self-defense," I said, sitting up slowly, wincing at the pain in my ankle. He came at me with a knife. "In our church," said the man with the shotgun, speaking for the first time. His voice was quieter than the others, more controlled on our land. "I didn't know," I said. "I was lost. The storm yesterday." "Shut up." The bearded one cut me off. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." I didn't move fast enough, so he grabbed my shoulder and roughly spun me around, shoving me face first into the ground. My cheek pressed into the cold dirt as he yanked my arms behind me. "Jim, got those ties?" he asked. The lean one. Jim stepped forward, pulling something from his pocket. A moment later, I felt the bite of plastic zip ties closing around my wrists, pulling painfully tight. "That's too tight," I protested. "My hands will go numb." "That's the idea," Jim said. "Can't have you trying anything else with those fingers." The bearded one hauled me back to my feet. Up close, I could see more details of their appearances. All 3 men looked weathered, their clothing well-worn, but practical for outdoor life. They carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to the woods, but there was something else in their posture, a constant alertness, like predators. "I'm Tom," said the one with the shotgun, gesturing with the barrel. "That's Jim and Will." He nodded toward the bearded one, who must have been William. "And you've met Rob already." "Look," I tried again. "There's been a mistake. I'm just a hiker who got lost. If you let me go, I swear I won't report any of this. I just want to get back to my car and go home." William shoved me forward, making me stumble on my sore ankle. "Start walking." "Where are we going?" I asked. "Camp," Jim answered. "Rob wants a proper chat with you." Tom kept the shotgun trained on me as we began walking. William gripped my arm tightly, steering me through the dark forest. Jim led the way with his flashlight, picking out a path that wasn't visible to my eyes. "How far?" I asked after several minutes of walking. "Far enough that no one finds it," Tom said from behind me. "Not that anyone's looking." We walked for what felt like an hour, though without my watch visible. I couldn't be sure. My ankle throbbed with each step. The zip ties cut into my wrists when I tried to move them. The men rarely spoke, communicating mostly through gestures and nods that spoke of long familiarity. The path they followed seemed random to me, weaving between trees with no discernible trail. Yet they moved with certainty, never hesitating at forks or obstacles. "You live out here?" I asked, trying to gather information, anything that might help me later. "Going on 3 years now," William said, surprising me by answering. "Best decision we ever made. No rent, no taxes, nosy neighbors," Jim added from ahead of us. "Just freedom and the occasional hiker to murder." I couldn't stop myself from asking. The grip on my arm tightened painfully. "Only the ones who don't respect boundaries," William growled. Like that family in the church? I asked immediately, regretting the words as they left my mouth. Tom prodded me with the shotgun barrel. They got what tourists get when they ignore warnings. What warnings? The markings, Jim said. The signs, the yellow-green stuff you saw. That's our mark means, keep out. Most folks are smart enough to turn around when they see it. I never saw any markings, I said. Then you weren't paying attention, William said. We marked the borders clear enough. We continued in silence after that. The terrain gradually changed, the ground becoming more level. The spaces between trees widened slightly. Eventually, we stepped into a small clearing, and I saw their camp for the first time. It was more established than I had expected. 4 crude tents surrounded. A central fire pit where embers still glowed. Red dot tarps stretched between trees created additional sheltered areas. Supplies were stacked and organized around the perimeter. Containers of water, weapons, tools, even what looked like solar panels leaning against a tree. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was a permanent settlement. Robert sat by the fire, his shoulder wrapped in a bloody makeshift bandage. His face was illuminated by the dying embers, making his expression even more menacing. When he saw us enter the clearing, he stood up. "You found our guest," he said, eyes fixing on me with cold hatred. "Excellent work, boys." He walked toward me, and I instinctively tried to back away, but William's grip held me in place. Robert stopped directly in front of me. Without warning, his fist connected with my stomach. I doubled over, gasping for breath. Would have fallen if William hadn't been holding me up. "That's for my shoulder," Robert said calmly, flexing his hand, though we've only just started balancing accounts. When I could breathe again, I straightened up to face him. "Those people in the church, that family, did you kill them?" Robert smiled, an expression more frightening than his anger had been. "They were trespassing just like you. They were innocent people," I said. "Children." "They were warnings," Robert corrected me. "Messages for others to stay away. Didn't work too well in your case, did it?" He turned to the others. "Secure him to that oak for the night. We'll have a proper talk in the morning when I can see his face better." Tom and William dragged me to a large oak tree at the edge of the clearing. Jim retrieved a length of rope from one of the supply piles. They made me sit with my back against the trunk, then wrapped the rope around my chest and the tree several times, binding me tightly in place. My zip-tied hands remained behind me, pressed uncomfortably against the rough bark. "Try to get some sleep," Robert said, his voice mockingly gentle. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day for you." The men retreated to the fire, where Robert began speaking to them in low tones I couldn't quite make out. Occasionally, one of them would glance in my direction, then continue the conversation. I tested my bonds, finding them secure, but not completely immobilizing. The rope around my chest had some give to it, and I could slide my body up and down slightly against the tree trunk. The bark behind me was rough, with sharp ridges and edges. As the men continued their discussion by the fire, I began subtly working my bound wrists against the bark, hoping to fray the plastic zip ties. It was a desperate move, but desperation was all I had left. Robert sat back down by the fire, his shoulder bandaged with what looked like a torn shirt already soaked through with blood. The wound I'd given him was deeper than I'd hoped. I shifted my position against the tree, testing the rope. It had some give. Not much, but maybe enough. The zip ties were my bigger problem. If I could wear them down against the bark without the men noticing. "How's the shoulder, Rob?" William asked, dropping onto a log across the fire pit. Robert grimaced. "Hurts like a son of a butt. I've had worse." His eyes found mine across the clearing. "Our friend here is going to have much worse before we're done." Jim tossed several branches onto the fire, sending sparks swirling upward. The flames cast their faces in flickering orange light, making their weathered features look even more menacing. "Want me to take a proper look at it?" Tom asked, setting his shotgun down within easy reach. Robert shook his head. In the morning, too dark to see much now. So, what's the plan with him? Jim nodded in my direction. Robert leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Same as the others. Find out what he knows. Who knows he's out here? Then make an example of him. My stomach twisted at his casual tone. These men had done this before, multiple times, judging by how they talked about it. I'm not a threat to you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't even know anyone lived out here. Robert laughed. That's what they all say. He turned to the others. Remember that couple last summer? Kept swearing they were just bird watchers, right up until we found the survey equipment in their packs. William added, What is this place? I asked, partly to distract them from noticing my efforts with the restraints, partly because I needed to understand what I'd stumbled into. Why are you so protective of it? Robert studied me for a long moment, then shrugged. Why not tell him? Not like he's going anywhere. He reached for a metal cup beside him and took a drink before continuing. Used to be just me out here. Found this place 3 years back when I was on the run. Had some disagreements with my former business partners. His smile was cold. Let's just say the law was looking for me with more enthusiasm than I appreciated. You're hiding from the police, I said. From everyone, Robert corrected. That's the beauty of it. No one comes out this deep. Not normally. I met Jim about 6 months in, he continued, gesturing to the bearded man. He had his own reasons for wanting to disappear. Jim grunted. Restraining orders don't mean much out here. Tom and Will joined up last year, Robert said. Tom, after a bar fight went bad. Well, after some trouble with his employer's accounting. You mean you're all criminals? I said. Tom's hand drifted toward the shotgun. Prefer to think of ourselves as men who didn't fit in the system. So you hide in the woods and murder innocent people. Robert's expression darkened. We established territory, set boundaries, made it clear this area was claimed. He leaned forward. Not our fault if people ignore the warnings. What warnings? I asked again. I never saw any signs or markers. The yellow-green marks, William said. We put them on trees at the borders. Most folks see those and turn back. Something about them just feels wrong, even if you don't know what they mean. I thought back to my hike before finding the body tied to the tree. Had there been markers I missed? Strange markings on trees that I'd walked right past. What is that stuff anyway? I asked. On the bodies in the church? Robert smiled, seeming pleased with the question. Something special. We make local plants mostly. Some other ingredients. He exchanged glances with the others. Preserves things nicely. Makes the warnings last longer. I felt sick imagining them concocting this substance, specifically to preserve their victims as displays. The family in the church, I said, unable to stop myself. Why them? They were just camping. They were persistent, Tom said, poking at the fire with a stick. Ignored the markers. Set up camp right in the middle of a whole bunch of them. Even took pictures of the marks, Jim added. Thought they were interesting. Some kind of nature art, they said. We watched them for 2 days, Robert continued. Left more warnings at night. They just kept taking pictures, talking about putting them online. So, you killed them, I said, my voice hollow. Children too. Children grow up, Robert said, his tone matter-of-fact. Grow up to come looking for what happened to Mom and Dad. I couldn't believe the casualness with which they discussed murder. These men had completely disconnected from humanity, from any sense of right and wrong. You're sick, I said. All of you. Robert's smile never faltered. Maybe, or maybe, we're just free. No rules out here except ours. He stood up and walked toward me, stopping a few feet away. In his hand, I saw my pocket knife, the one I'd stabbed him with. He flipped it open, examining the small blade. Not much of a weapon, he said, turning it in the firelight. But you made it count. Without warning, he closed the distance and crouched in front of me. holding the knife near my face. I pressed back against the tree, the rope biting into my chest. "We're going to have a proper conversation in the morning," Robert said quietly, "about who you are. Who knows you're out here and exactly how you found us." He traced the flat of the blade along my cheek, not cutting, just threatening. "It's going to hurt a lot, but that's the price of trespassing." He stood up and returned to the fire, slipping my knife into his pocket. The men began talking among themselves, discussing plans for tomorrow. Their voices grew animated as they debated different methods of interrogation. "The fingernails first," Jim suggested. "Always gets them talking fast." "Nah," Tom countered. "Start with the feet. Can't run away if the feet are dealt with." "I like working on the face," William said quietly. "See the fear up close." They talked about torture with the casual interest of men discussing fishing techniques. My wrists moved faster against the tree bark, desperation giving my efforts new urgency. "Got any family waiting for you back home?" Robert called over to me suddenly. I froze. "No liar," he said, not unkindly. "Everyone's got somebody. Parents, wife, kids." I stayed silent, unwilling to give him anything he could use against me. "Doesn't matter," he continued after a moment. "We'll find out tomorrow. People talk about what matters to them when they're hurting enough." The hours dragged on. The men took turns tending the fire and keeping watch. They seemed to need little sleep, accustomed to the vigilance their lifestyle required. Tom proved to be the lightest sleeper, his eyes snapping open at the smallest sounds from the forest around us. I continued working at my restraints whenever I could, making slow progress against the zip ties. The plastic began to fray, weakening with each scrape against the rough bark. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. My watch was hidden beneath the rope, but the moon had shifted position significantly in the sky above. Robert eventually rolled himself in a blanket near the fire, his back to me. Jim and William retreated to their tents, while Tom took the first watch, sitting on a log with his shotgun across his knees, occasionally scanning the perimeter with alert eyes. The camp grew quieter. Only the sounds of the fire crackling and occasional snores from Robert broke the silence. Tom's head began to nod after an hour, though he would jerk awake every few minutes, checking the camp before dozing off again. I kept working at the zip ties, ignoring the pain as the plastic cut into my wrists and the bark scraped my skin raw. Hours passed this way, with agonizingly slow progress. By what must have been the early hours of the morning, I felt the zip tie on my right wrist give way slightly, not broken, but weakened enough that a strong pull might snap it. The tree's bark had done its work, creating tiny cuts in the plastic that compromised its strength. Tom had finally surrendered to sleep, his chin resting on his chest, the shotgun still balanced across his lap. William had emerged from his tent at some point to take over watch, but had positioned himself on the far side of the camp, his attention focused outward into the forest. I knew I might not get another chance. Robert's promise of what morning would bring left no doubt about what waited for me when the sun rose. If I was going to act, it had to be now. I braced myself, took a deep breath, and pulled my wrists apart with all my strength. The zip tie stretched, resisted, then snapped with a small popping sound that seemed deafening in the quiet camp. I froze, watching the men for any reaction. Tom shifted in his sleep, but didn't wake. William remained with his back to me, scanning the trees beyond the camp. My hands were free now, though the rope around my chest still held me to the tree. I worked my fingers under the coils, finding where Jim had tied the knot. It was secure, but not impossible. These men were skilled with ropes, but they'd been more concerned with the zip ties holding my hands. Slowly, carefully, I worked at the knot, loosening it bit by bit. My fingers stiff and sore from hours bound behind me. Fumbled several times. Each small sound made me pause, heart pounding as I watched for any sign that the men had noticed. The rope finally gave way enough for me to begin working it down my chest. I had to move slowly, easing it downward, inch by inch, to prevent it from catching and making noise. Sweat ran down my face despite the cool night air dripping onto my hands as they worked. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I had loosened the rope enough to slip my shoulders through. I held it carefully as I extracted myself, making sure it didn't fall against the tree and alert my captors. I was free, but I was still in the middle of their camp, surrounded by 4 killers who would torture me to death if they caught me again. I scanned the camp one last time. Robert slept near the dying fire. Tom dozed, sitting up with his shotgun. Jim was in his tent. William stood at the far edge of the clearing, facing away from me. This was my chance, probably the only one I'd get. I eased away from the tree, staying low, moving as quietly as I could. Every muscle in my body tensed with the effort of silent movement. My ankle throbbed where I'd twisted it during the chase, but the pain was secondary to the desperate need to escape. I'd reached the edge of the clearing about 20 feet from where I'd been tied when Tom shifted in his sleep. The shotgun slipped slightly in his lap, the metal making a soft sound against his belt buckle. I froze, watching as his eyes blinked open. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, looking around the camp as he gathered his wits. His gaze drifted toward the tree where I'd been tied, the empty tree. I saw the moment realization hit him. His eyes widened, and he jumped to his feet. "Rob," he shouted. "He's gone. Rob, he's gone." Tom's shout shattered the night, jolting everyone in the camp awake. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran into the forest, staying low, trying to put as much distance between myself and the camp as possible before they organized a pursuit. Behind me, chaos erupted. Robert's voice bellowed orders. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping in frantic arcs as the men scrambled to their feet. "Get the lights. Check the perimeter," Robert shouted. I crashed through underbrush, not caring about noise now that stealth was impossible. My hands stung from rope burns and bark scrapes. My twisted ankle screamed with each footfall, but adrenaline dulled the pain enough to keep moving. The forest was a maze of black trunks against deeper blackness. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in patches, offering just enough illumination to avoid running headfirst into trees. I had no idea which direction led to safety, only that I needed to get as far from those men as possible. "Spread out," Robert's voice carried through the trees behind me. "Jim, east side. Tom, west. Will, circle around and cut 'em off." They were organizing, using their knowledge of the terrain to try to trap me. These men knew these woods in ways I never would. They'd been living here for years, hunting people like me. I angled left, hoping to throw off their prediction of my path. My lungs burned as I gulped the cold night air. Sweat ran down my face despite the chill. I'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, running on nothing but fear and determination. Something crashed through the brush to my right, one of them getting closer. I changed direction again, ducking under a low-hanging branch and pushing deeper into a thicket of rhododendron. "I can hear you running," Robert called, his voice unnervingly calm. "Despite the situation, you're only making this worse for yourself." I kept moving, trying to control my breathing so I could listen for their approach. The darkness was both enemy and ally, hiding dangers from me, but also concealing me from my pursuers. Flashlight beams bounced through the trees behind me, getting closer. They were gaining ground, moving with the confidence of men who knew every rock and root in these woods. "When we catch you, and we will catch you. What happened to the family and the church will seem merciful." Robert's voice echoed between the trees, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I stumbled over an exposed root and nearly fell, catching myself against a tree trunk. Pain shot through my shoulder on impact. I took a moment to orient myself, looking up at the sky. Through breaks in the canopy, I could see stars and a sliver of moon. If I could keep the moon on my left shoulder, I might be able to maintain a consistent direction rather than running in circles. The sound of men crashing through the forest surrounded me now. They had spread out, trying to flank me. A flashlight beam swept past about 50 yards to my right. Another appeared to my left, more distant, but moving parallel to my path. I started running again, pushing myself harder, though my muscles protested. Each breath felt like fire in my chest. The cuts on my arms and face from branches stung as sweat dripped into them. "He's heading north," someone shouted. It sounded like William. "Cut him off at the ridge," Robert called back. They were tracking me, communicating my position to each other. I veered sharply right, abandoning my planned course, hoping to throw them off. The ground began to slope upward, making each step more taxing. I know these woods better than my own face. Robert's voice followed me. "There's nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide. Might as well make it easy on yourself." I knew he was lying. There had to be a way out of these woods. There had to be a road, a trail, some sign of civilization somewhere ahead. The alternative was unthinkable. The slope grew steeper. I used tree trunks to pull myself upward, my legs burning with exhaustion. If I could reach higher ground, maybe I could spot something. Lights from a town, a road, anything that might lead to safety. A sharp crack split the air, followed by the splintering of wood inches from my head. The sound registered before I understood what had happened. A gunshot? One of them had fired at me. "Next one won't miss," Thomas shouted from somewhere behind me. "Stop running." Fear gave me new energy. I scrambled up the incline, using hands and feet to climb more than run. Another shot rang out, this one farther off target, the bullet thudding into a tree several feet away. "Don't kill him, Tom," Robert yelled. "We need him alive." That confirmed what I had suspected. They wanted to capture me, not kill me outright. They wanted information first, wanted to know who I might have told about them. As long as I stayed ahead of them, they wouldn't risk a fatal shot. I reached the top of the ridge and paused for just a moment, sucking air into my burning lungs. The trees thinned slightly here, allowing more moonlight to penetrate. Below me, flashlight beams crisscrossed through the forest as the men continued their pursuit. "He's on the ridge," Jim's voice carried up from below. "I can see him against the sky." I dropped low, breaking my silhouette, and began moving along the ridge line. Running was easier here with less undergrowth to fight through. I picked up speed, ignoring the protests from my exhausted body. "Circle around," Robert ordered. "We'll go west and cut him off. Jim, stay on his trail. Tom with me." They were coordinating, using their numbers to their advantage. I couldn't outrun all four of them. Not for long. My only hope was to find a place to hide or reach civilization before they caught me. The ridge began to descend again. I followed it down, half running, half sliding on the loose soil and leaves out at the bottom. The forest opened slightly into a small clearing. I hesitated at the edge, reluctant to cross open ground where I'd be visible, but staying put wasn't an option. I took a deep breath and sprinted across the clearing, making for the trees on the far side. I was halfway across when a beam of light caught me. "There," William shouted. Another shot rang out. Something hot sliced across my upper arm. The bullet had grazed me. Warm blood trickled down to my elbow. I said, "Alive, damn it," Robert bellowed. I reached the trees and plunged back into the forest, clutching my arm. The wound burned, but didn't seem deep. More concerning was how close they were getting. "You can run all night," Robert called, his voice closer now. "But we live here. We hunt here. This is our home. You're just passing through, on your way to the ground." His laughter echoed through the trees, joined by the others. The sound chilled me more than the night air. I kept moving, trying to vary my path, trying to throw them off, but they seemed to anticipate my every turn. When I veered left, a flashlight appeared ahead of me. When I turned right, I heard footsteps paralleling my course. "We're just going to tire you out," Jim called. "Make you easier to handle when we get our hands on you." My strength was fading. They were right about that. Hours of running, the injury to my ankle, the new wound on my arm, and the emotional toll of everything I'd seen. It was all catching up to me, but giving up meant torture and death. As long as I could move, I would run. I spotted a fallen tree ahead, its massive trunk creating a temporary barrier. I dropped behind it, pressing my body into the ground, trying to control my ragged breathing. Maybe if they lost sight of me, they'd spread out further, create some gaps in their line that I could slip through. Flashlight beams swept the forest around me. I could hear them moving, circling, closing in methodically. "He stopped running," William said. His voice was alarmingly close. "Smart," Robert replied. "Conserving energy, but it won't help." I lay still, barely breathing, as a beam of light passed over the log I was hiding behind. It paused, then swept back, lingering on the fallen trunk. "Check behind that tree," Robert ordered. Footsteps approached my hiding place. I tensed, preparing to run again the moment I was spotted. The beam of light rose up and over the log, illuminating me where I lay. I met Tom's eyes behind the flashlight, saw his mouth curve into a smile. "Found him," he said quietly. I rolled away as he lunged, scrambling to my feet and taking off once more into the darkness. His fingers brushed my jacket, but failed to grab hold. "He's moving again," Tom shouted, heading east. I ran with renewed desperation, knowing they were right behind me now. My foot caught on something, a root or rock, and I went down hard, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs. I tried to get up, but my body betrayed me, refusing to move fast enough. Before I could regain my feet, rough hands grabbed me from behind. I fought, twisting and striking out blindly, but another set of hands joined the first. They dragged me upright, pinning my arms. "Got him," Jim called out, his beard scratching against my face as he restrained me. I thrashed wildly, but William grabbed my other arm, securing me between them. Flashlight beams converged on my face, blinding me. Well, Robert's voice came from behind the lights. That was quite a chase. He stepped into view, his face terrible in the harsh light. Blood had soaked through the bandage on his shoulder where I'd stabbed him. In his hand, he held my pocket knife blade open. "You made us work for it," he said, twirling the small blade between his fingers. "I respect that, but now the real work begins." "Please," I gasped, still struggling to catch my breath. "Just let me go. I won't tell anyone about you." Robert laughed, the sound echoed by the others. "That's what they all say right before they start begging us to kill them." He stepped closer, raising the knife to my face. "Hold him steady," he instructed Jim and William. "This is going to get messy." I closed my eyes, bracing for the pain to come, when a distant sound made us all freeze. Engines, the unmistakable sound of vehicle engines, somewhere in the distance. My eyes snapped open. Robert was looking off into the forest, his head tilted, listening. "That's the highway," Thomas said, lowering his shotgun slightly. "How far?" Robert asked sharply. "Not far," William replied. "Half-mile, maybe less." Hope surged through me. A road meant people, safety, escape. I renewed my struggle against the hands holding me, surprising Jim enough that his grip loosened momentarily. I twisted free of his grasp, tearing my arm from William's hold before he could tighten it. Robert lunged for me, but I ducked under his reach and took off running toward the sound of the engines. "After him," Robert shouted. "Don't let him reach the road." I ran with everything I had left, every ounce of strength and will. The sound of engines grew louder. Definitely a highway, definitely close. The men crashed through the forest behind me, their pursuit more frantic now. They knew what I knew. Once I reached other people, their advantage would vanish. "If you make it out of these woods," Robert called after me, his voice filled with rage, "we'll find you. We'll find your family, your friends, everyone you've ever cared about. This doesn't end when you reach the road." I ignored his threats, focused only on the growing sound ahead. The trees began to thin. The ground sloped downward, and then I saw it through the trunks ahead. The reflective surface of guardrails catching moonlight. A road. Civilization. Safety. Stop him. Robert's voice cracked with desperation. Another gunshot rang out. This one wasn't aimed to miss. The bullet whizzed past my ear, close enough that I felt its passage. I burst through the final line of trees onto a grassy embankment. Below me lay a 2-lane highway, dark and empty in the night. But then, around a distant curve, headlights appeared, growing brighter as a vehicle approached. I half ran, half tumbled down the grassy embankment toward the highway, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The headlights grew larger as the vehicle approached, my only chance at survival after hours of being hunted through the forest. "He's going for the road," Robert bellowed behind me, his voice carrying the edge of someone watching their prey escape. My twisted ankles screamed with each step. Blood from the bullet graze on my arm had soaked my sleeve, making it stick to my skin. Every breath burned in my chest, but the sight of those approaching headlights gave me strength. I didn't know I had left. I reached the asphalt and staggered into the middle of the lane, waving my arms wildly above my head. The pickup truck's headlights blinded me as the driver spotted my sudden appearance and hit the brakes. Tires squealed against pavement. The truck skidded, coming to a stop just yards away from where I stood swaying. "Help," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Please help me." I stumbled forward and collapsed against the hood of the truck. The warm metal, the first human-made thing I'd touched in what felt like forever. Behind me, at the tree, I heard the crashing of branches as my pursuers reached the edge of the forest. The driver's door flew open. A stocky man in his early 50s jumped out, his eyes wide with shock. "Jesus Christ," he exclaimed, taking in my bloodied appearance. "What happened to you?" "Call the police," I gasped, pushing myself off the hood and staggering toward him. "There are men in the woods. They're trying to kill me. We need to go now." The man glanced past me toward the tree, then back at my face. He must have seen the raw terror there, because he immediately reached into his pocket for his phone. "Get in," he said, moving quickly around to help me. "I'm Gary Jensen." I looked back over my shoulder. In the glow of the truck's headlights, I could see 4 figures at the edge of the trees. They stood partially concealed, watching, calculating. Robert was in front, his tall form unmistakable, even at this distance. "They're right there," I said, grabbing Gary's arm, "right at the tree line. 4 of them. They've been hunting me all night." Gary helped me around to the passenger side, his arm strong under my shoulder. As he opened the door, I heard Robert's voice carry across the distance between us. "This isn't over," he called. "We know what you look like now. We'll find you. Wherever you go, we'll find everyone you care about." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the night air. Gary helped me into the seat, then hurried back to the driver's side, already dialing his phone. 911. "What's your emergency?" I heard faintly as the call connected. "I'm on Highway 16, about 3 miles east of the Burton Creek Bridge," Gary said, climbing in and slamming his door. "I've got a badly injured man who says people are trying to kill him. There are men at the tree line right now watching us." He started the engine and threw the truck into gear, executing a quick 3-point turn to head back the way he'd come. As we accelerated away, I twisted in my seat to look back. The 4 figures had stepped further onto the embankment, illuminated in our taillights. They made no attempt to chase the truck, but the sight of them standing there watching us drive away sent another wave of fear through me. "I need an ambulance and police," Gary continued into the phone, his voice steady despite the situation. "He's bleeding and looks like he's been through hell." I slumped back in the seat, the adrenaline that had kept me going starting to ebb. The pain from my various injuries rushed in to fill the void. "They're sending units from Asheville," Gary told me, putting the phone on speaker and placing it on the dashboard. "Ambulance too." You want to tell me what happened? Who were those guys? I swallowed hard, my throat dry and raw from running and shouting. They live in the woods. They've been killing hikers who wander into their territory. I found bodies, a whole family in an abandoned church. When I tried to leave, they caught me. Gary's eyes widened, but he kept his focus on the road, accelerating to well above the speed limit. How long were they holding you? Since yesterday, I said, the events blurring together in my mind. They tied me to a tree. They were planning to torture me in the morning. Find out who knew I was hiking there. Sir, are you still there? The emergency dispatcher's voice came through the phone speaker. Still here, Gary replied. We are heading east on 16 toward Asheville, going as fast as I safely can. Units are en route to your location, the dispatcher said. Can you tell me more about the injured person's condition? Gary glanced at me. He's conscious, but pretty beat up. Looks like cuts all over, maybe a gunshot wound on his arm. I nodded weakly. Bullet grazed me. They shot at me when I was running. Did you hear that? Gary asked the dispatcher. Yes, sir. Please continue, toward Asheville. Officers will intercept you on the highway. Can the injured person provide any information about his attackers? I leaned toward the phone. For men. They've been living in the forest for years. Their leader is named Robert. The others are James, Thomas, and William. They've killed multiple people. There's a family, mother, father, 3 kids, all murdered in an old church about I don't know how far from the highway. My voice cracked as the images of those posed bodies flooded back into my mind. Sir, can you remember where this church is located? The dispatcher asked. I shook my head, though she couldn't see it. I got lost during a storm. Everything in the forest seemed wrong after that. Compasses didn't work right. GPS showed impossible locations. Gary shot me a concerned look. I knew how it sounded, but it was the truth. I can try to help them find it, I continued. I remember parts of the path and their camp. They had a permanent settlement with tents, supplies, weapons. Officers will want to take your full statement when they reach you, the dispatcher assured me. For now, just stay on the line and keep heading toward Asheville. I nodded again, then remembered she couldn't see me. Okay. Gary pressed harder on the accelerator. The trees on either side of the highway blurred as we sped through the night. Every few seconds, he checked the rearview mirror. You think they're following us? I asked, fighting to stay alert as exhaustion threatened to pull me under. Gary shook his head. Not in a vehicle. But I don't like the way. They were just standing there watching, like they weren't worried about you getting away. Robert's partying threat echoed in my mind. He said they'd find me, find my family and friends. Let the police worry about that, Gary said firmly. Right now, we need to get you to a hospital. I looked down at myself for the first time since escaping the forest. My clothes were torn and filthy, covered in dirt, blood, and pine sap. My hands were raw from scraping against the tree bark to free myself. Dried blood caked the bullet graze on my arm. I probably looked like a madman. Thank you, I said quietly. If you hadn't come along when you did, Gary nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. I wasn't even supposed to be out this late. Job ran long. Customer insisted we finish today. The irony of how random chance had saved my life wasn't lost on me. If Gary had finished his work on time, if he'd taken a different route home, if the timing had been off by even a minute in either direction, I'd likely be dead by morning. What kind of work do you do? I asked, partly out of genuine curiosity, partly to keep myself conscious. Construction, small contracting business, Gary replied. Mostly residential remodeling, some commercial work. Today was a kitchen renovation that the owners needed done before some big dinner party tomorrow. Such a normal conversation felt surreal after everything I'd experienced. Kitchen renovations and dinner parties existed in another world from the one I'd been trapped in for the past 2 days. I see headlights, Gary suddenly announced, leaning forward over the steering wheel. Lots of them coming this way. I turned to look through the windshield. In the distance, a line of flashing lights approached, cutting through the darkness. Police escort for the ambulance, Gary explained. Dispatcher said they'd meet us on the road. Relief washed over me. Real help was coming. People who would believe me, who would search those woods and find the evidence of what Robert and his men had done. As we drew closer to the approaching vehicles, Gary slowed the truck and pulled onto the shoulder. 3 police cruisers led the way, followed by an ambulance. They formed a half circle around us, lights painting the night and rotating red and blue. Officers emerged from their vehicles, hands near their weapons as they approached cautiously. Gary rolled down his window. "I'm Gary Jensen," he called out. "I called this in. This man needs medical attention." 2 EMTs hurried from the ambulance with a stretcher, while an officer came to Gary's window. Another officer circled to my side of the truck and opened the door. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" the officer asked, shining a flashlight over me to assess my condition. "David Mitchell," I replied, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "There are killers in the forest. They've murdered multiple people." The EMTs reached me then, gently helping me from the truck onto the stretcher. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through my battered body. "He says there are 4 men living in the forest who've been murdering hikers," Gary explained to the officers. "We saw them at the tree line where I picked him up. We'll need statements from both of you," the officer said. "But first, let's get him medical attention." As the EMTs secured me to the stretcher, I grabbed one officer's sleeve. "You have to search the forest. There's an old church with 5 bodies inside, a family, and more victims tied to trees deeper in the woods. We'll organize search teams right away," the officer assured me. "But first, we need to make sure you're stable." They loaded me into the ambulance. One of the EMTs immediately began checking my vital signs, while the other cut away my sleeve to examine the bullet graze. "Blood pressure's low," the first EMT said, "pulse elevated, signs of dehydration and exhaustion." I felt an oxygen mask being placed over my face. The cool flow of air was soothing, but it couldn't wash away the fear still gripping me. Through the open doors of the ambulance, I saw Gary talking with the officers, gesturing back the way we had come. He was pointing toward the forest, describing where he'd found me. One of the officers climbed into the ambulance with me, notepad in hand. "Mr. Mitchell, I know you've been through a lot, but if you can give us any details about where to find these men or the victims you mentioned, it would help us start searching right away." I pulled the oxygen mask aside. "I can take you there. Let me help you find them." The EMT gently replaced the mask. "Sir, you need medical attention first. You've lost blood, you're dehydrated, and you have multiple injuries." The officer nodded in agreement. "We'll get your full statement at the hospital. My colleagues are already setting up a search operation based on the location where Mr. Jensen found you." I wanted to protest, to insist they take me back to the forest immediately, but exhaustion was finally winning. The relative safety of the ambulance, the presence of professionals taking charge, allowed my body to begin shutting down. After pushing beyond its limits, the last thing I saw before the ambulance doors closed was Gary standing with the officers, still describing what had happened. He glanced my way and gave a small nod of reassurance as the ambulance pulled away. Lights flashing and siren wailing, I closed my eyes. Robert's final threat played through my mind again. "We'll find you. We'll find everyone you care about." They were still out there in those woods, and I knew with absolute certainty they wouldn't be found unless they wanted to be. I woke up disoriented in a hospital room, the steady beep of monitors replacing the forest sounds that had filled my ears for days. Sunlight filtered through blinds on windows that looked out onto brick walls and air conditioning units, and 4-line ran from my arm to a bag of clear fluid hanging beside the bed. A nurse noticed I was awake and approached with a clipboard. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell. How are you feeling?" "Like I got dragged through hell backward," I said, my voice rough. My throat felt like sandpaper, and every muscle in my body ached. How long have I been here? You came in last night. You've been asleep for about 14 hours. I tried to sit up and winced as pain shot through my arm where the bullet had grazed me. The wound was now properly cleaned and bandaged. Looking down, I saw my other cuts had been treated too, some with butterfly bandages, others with proper stitches. The doctor will be in soon to check on you, the nurse said, adjusting something on my fore. And there's a police detective who'd like to speak with you when you're up to it. Tell them to come now, I said. They need to find those men before they disappear. The nurse gave me a look that mixed sympathy with doubt. It was a look I'd become very familiar with over the next 8 days. Detective Sarah Collins arrived an hour later after a doctor had examined me and confirmed I was suffering from dehydration, exhaustion, a sprained ankle, and numerous lacerations. The bullet graze on my arm had been cleaned and treated, though the doctor mentioned I was lucky it hadn't been a few inches to the right. Detective Collins was a woman in her late 30s, with her hair pulled back in a practical style. She carried a notebook and a recording device, setting both on the small table beside my bed. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Detective Sarah Collins," she said, showing me her badge. "I understand you've been through quite an ordeal. If you're feeling up to it, I'd like to ask you some questions about what happened to you." "Did you find them?" I asked immediately. "Robert and the others, did you search the forest?" "We have teams searching the area where Mr. Jensen picked you up," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "But I need as much information from you as possible to help direct that search." "They're going to disappear," I said, frustration building. "They know someone got away. They'll move their camp, hide the evidence. That's why I need your help," she said, turning on her recording device. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything you remember." So I did. I told her about getting lost in the storm, about the forest changing around me, about finding the first body tied to a tree, and then the family in the church. I described Robert's appearance in detail, his matted hair, his weather-beaten face, the yellow-green substance smeared on his clothes. I told her about James, Thomas, and William, about being tied to a tree, about my escape in the chase through the forest. Throughout my account, Detective Collins took notes without comment. Her face remained professionally blank, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes when I mentioned the forest changing or compasses not working properly. "Can you give me any GPS coordinates?" she asked when I'd finished. "Any landmarks that might help us locate these sites?" I gave her the last coordinates I remembered checking before things went wrong. Describing the rock overhang where I'd sheltered during the storm, I tried to recall the direction and distance I'd traveled to find the church, the approximate location of their camp relative to the highway. "I can show you on a map," I said. "I can go with your search teams. I might not remember exact coordinates, but I could recognize landmarks. Let's focus on your recovery first," she said, closing her notebook. "We have experienced search teams who know these mountains well. They won't find anything without me," I insisted. "These men have been living out there for years without being caught. They know how to hide." Detective Collins sighed slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, I want to be honest with you. We've searched this area before. We've had reports of strange encounters in these woods over the years, but we've never found evidence of anyone living there permanently or any of the activities you described." "So, you don't believe me?" I said flatly. "I believe you were attacked," she replied carefully. "Your injuries are real," Mr. Jensen confirmed, seeing 4 men at the tree. "What I need is evidence to find and prosecute these individuals." Over the next few days, my frustration grew as reports came back from the search teams. They'd found nothing at the coordinates I provided. No rock overhang that matched my description, no church, no bodies tied to trees. The forest appeared undisturbed, with no signs of recent human activity beyond the occasional hiker's boot print on established trails. By the 4th day, I was able to move around with crutches due to my sprained ankle. The doctor wanted me to stay for continued observation and to ensure my wounds didn't become infected. I spent hours looking at maps with Detective Collins, trying to pinpoint where I'd been, but everything seemed wrong. The maps showed familiar. Landmarks I should have encountered, trails I should have crossed, but none matched my experience. "This doesn't make sense," I said, throwing down a map in frustration during one of our sessions. "I know what I saw. I know what happened to me." "No one is saying it didn't happen," Detective Collins replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But we need physical evidence." "Then let me go with the search teams," I demanded. "I can show them where to look. You're still recovering. I'm well enough to walk around this hospital. I'm well enough to go back into those woods." After more arguments, and against medical advice, Detective Collins finally arranged for me to join a search team on my 6th day in the hospital. I was transported by police vehicle to the stretch of highway where Gary Jensen had found me. Standing at the edge of the forest, leaning on my crutches, I felt a cold dread creeping through me. The trees looked normal in the daylight, just an ordinary Appalachian forest, but I knew what lurked beyond that seemingly innocent facade. "This is approximately where Mr. Jensen reported picking you up," Detective Collins said, consulting her notes. "Does anything look familiar?" I studied the tree line, trying to match it with my fragmented memories of bursting out of the forest in the darkness. "I came from that direction," I said, pointing to a slight depression between two larger oak trees. "I ran down that slope." 4 officers accompanied us, carrying equipment and weapons. They looked skeptical but professional as they followed my directions into the forest. Detective Collins stayed close beside me as I hobbled along on one crutch, the other tucked under my arm for when the terrain became too rough. The highway noise faded faster than I expected. One officer remarked as we moved deeper into the trees. I found signs of my passage: broken branches at about shoulder height, disturbances in the forest floor that could have been made by someone running. But as we followed this trail backward, attempting to trace my flight from Robert and his men, things became increasingly confusing. "This doesn't look right," I said after we'd hiked for nearly an hour. "The trees should be older here, bigger. These trees are at least 60 years old," one of the officers said, looking around at the mature forest. "No, I mean really old. Massive, like cathedral pillars." I turned in a circle, trying to orient myself, and there should be a clearing somewhere nearby where they had their camp. We searched for another hour, following my confused directions as I tried to reconcile my memories with the forest around us. Eventually, we came to a small stream. "There was no stream," I said, staring at the water in disbelief. "I never crossed any water during the chase." Detective Collins exchanged looks with the other officers. "Mr. Mitchell, streams don't appear overnight." "I know that," I snapped, frustration building. "Which means we're in the wrong place, where they've somehow managed to hide everything." We continued searching until late afternoon, covering miles of forest in various directions from where I'd emerged. We found nothing. No church, no camp, no bodies, no evidence of the men who had hunted me. "I don't understand," I said, as we finally turned back toward the highway. "It was real. All of it was real. No one is saying it wasn't," Detective Collins repeated, though her tone had grown increasingly doubtful throughout the day. "But without physical evidence, there's not much more we can do." I spent my final 2 days in the hospital, answering the same questions from different officials, going over my story repeatedly until I began to doubt my own memories. Had the forest really changed after the storm? Or had I just been more disoriented than I realized? Had the men been as organized and established as I thought? Or were they just temporary squatters who moved on quickly? The only thing I knew with absolute certainty was the terror. I'd felt being hunted through those woods, and the images of those bodies that were burned into my memory. On the morning I was discharged, Detective Collins came to see me one last time. She handed me her card with her direct number written on the back. "The search teams will continue for another day or two," she said. "If we find anything, I'll contact you immediately." "You won't find anything," I said, tucking the card into my wallet. "They're too smart for that. They've had plenty of time to cover their tracks." "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice softening slightly, "I've been investigating disappearances in these mountains for years. People get lost in the wilderness. Sometimes they're never found. What happened to you was real. The injuries, the trauma, but we have to consider all possibilities. You think I'm making it up? That I did this to myself?" I gestured to my bandaged arm and the visible cuts on my face. "No, but extreme situations can affect perception. Isolation, fear, dehydration. They can alter how we experience reality." I looked at her for a long moment. "You think I hallucinated an entire family posed like dolls in an abandoned church? That I imagined being tied to a tree by 4 men who discussed how they were going to torture me? That Gary Jensen imagined seeing those men at the tree? Mr. Jensen confirmed seeing figures in the darkness. He couldn't identify them or hear what you claim they said to you." She paused. "Listen, I'm not dismissing your experience, but without evidence. Without evidence, you can't do anything." I finished for her. "I understand how it works, detective, but let me be clear about something. Those men are real. What they did was real, and they're still out there." I was released that afternoon. A hospital social worker had arranged a temporary accommodation for me in Asheville until I was well enough to travel back to my home several states away. As I was wheeled out to the taxi, I looked toward the mountains that rose in the distance. Mountains I had once loved, where I had found peace and solitude for over a decade of hiking. I knew then that I would never set foot in those forests again. Whatever had happened to me out there, whether the woods had truly changed or my perception had been altered by fear and exhaustion, the result was the same. The mountains that had once been my refuge were now forever tainted. I had escaped the forest, but I couldn't escape the certainty that somewhere in those ancient woods, 4 men were watching, waiting, and planning their next hunt.